This just in, Central Oregon has been in a drought for a while. Yet in May of 2022, we were at 106% of our average snow-to-water equivalent. In May of 2023, we were at 169% of our average snow-to-water equivalent. And as of today, we are at 114% of average snow-to-water equivalent. So why is it that most of Central Oregon is still abnormally dry or in moderate drought?
Because Central Oregon is basically a gigantic sponge.
Central Oregon is still somewhat volcanically active, which means we end up with a lot of porous, permeable rocks as opposed to the older, more weathered rocks on the west side of the Cascades.
So when rain and snow falls on the western slopes of the Cascades, it doesn't soak into the ground. It might soak into the ground a little bit. The soil can hold some water, but most of that water is going to run across the surface as rivers or streams.
Professor McKay tells me the best way to visualize Central Oregon like a sponge is with a sponge.
All right, so I have a sponge here, and the sponge actually, I know people who live in Central Oregon are familiar with basalt, and it's hard to think of basalt as being similar to a sponge. Basalt is a very dense, solid rock. It's the reason most of us here in Central Oregon don't have basements, because it's really expensive to excavate through this stuff.
Basalt is filled with tiny little holes, much like a sponge. So when rain and snow falls on basalt, it retains water, just like when you pour water onto a sponge.
And we can pour that water into the sponge, or on the sponge, which is our lava flow, and none of it is flowing across the surface as a river.
Now here's something I didn't know. You'd think in a land filled with lava tubes that a lava tube would act like a perfect kind of straw to help funnel water downhill, right? Nope.
So oftentimes there is a misconception that the groundwater must be flowing through lava tubes. And that's the whole reason that I created this little lava tube in here, is to show that no, groundwater doesn't travel through lava tubes, because that lava tube goes all the way back to here. So underneath my finger, there's the lava tube. If I pour water and make it rain in that location, the water does exactly what it did up here. It soaks through the sponge, drips down through the lava tube, goes to the floor of the lava tube, the base of the lava flow, and comes out with all the rest of the groundwater as springs. The lava tube itself doesn't act as a conveyor of groundwater, because it's just as porous as everything else around it.
This sponge-like basalt soaks up a lot of water. I mean, a lot of water. Thusly, it can continue to feed our springs for years without even much precipitation at all.
So you can have dry years for many years, and depending on the length of time that this water travels through the sponge, the spring here won't know that you're in a drought, because it's just still getting all of that water that sponge was holding from decades prior.
But like what we're experiencing now, this feature is a bit of a double-edged sword.
And then it's similar then when you get several wet years. Then then there's more precipitation. I can, make it rain and snow up here. But a lot of that water is just going to refill the sponge, and we're not going to see the effect in the springs. It's not like we have a heavy snow year and all of a sudden those springs are just gushing. So the sponge acts kind of like a buffer. It protects us from drought, but it also means that then when we've had multiple drought years, we're going to need more time to recharge that system.
And that system is so big and so deep that in theory, water we're drinking today could be water that fell when John Fremont, Kit Carson, and Billy Chinook first came through Central Oregon.
Yep, yeah, and we don't know the exact age of that water, but we do know that it is at least, 50, 60, 70 years old, maybe much older.
From the lava lands of Central Oregon, I'm Scott Elmas.